Good morning, everybody. I wanted to kind of follow up the last little video I did and talk a little bit more about the nature of Christian Tantra itself. Um, and I think the biggest points are these. Tantra is mystical and it is a wisdom path. That means two things. First of all, that the thinking about Jesus, the thought about God, and even like the praying to God and the praying to Jesus, um, the distance that exists when we as subjects pray to an object, in Tantra, that's a little bit less, that distance is preserved less, right? The starting point of a mystical path is the end stage contemplation that is the sort of final stage of a Christian prayer journey. So to talk about Tantra as a mystical path is to talk about a discipline where being with God is more important than thinking about God or even talking to God. If we can be with God in our silences, that is a good starting point. And in a sense, if we're not there, that's where we're going, right? The other thing is that Tantra is a wisdom path. Wisdom is experiential knowledge. It is also wisdom gained by an individual using all the guidance that they have available to them, and also as moral choice makers, risking that, holy cow, I might make this choice wrong. So there is in wisdom both an experiential knowledge component, but also a risk that I might do this wrong, and I'm on the hook for those consequences, right? So Tantra is both mystical, it concentrates on being with God, and it is a wisdom path. It concentrates on prudently using experiential knowledge at the risk of doing things wrong. Now, I'm also really attracted as a teacher to concise ways of summarizing teaching. I look, for instance, at the fact that when I was a monk, when I was a Trappist monk, I watched a Buddhist monk literally enumerate the central tenets of his faith on his fingers. His name was Tsering Phuntsok. He was a beautiful sort of expression of that teaching, right? And I started to ask, why can't I, as a Christian, enumerate as briefly as he did the central tenets of Christianity on my fingers? I even looked at the creeds and I said, boy, we're talking a lot about the nature of Jesus, but we aren't really summarizing what Jesus taught, right? Even the Eucharist is a beautiful expression of Jesus's teaching, Jesus's Jewishness, right? But the Eucharist is a practice; it's not a teaching. And I began to wonder, what might it look like to identify the four, if there are four, the four things that all Christian teaching have in common, and without equivocating Christianity and, say, the Buddhist catechetical model that I sort of took as my skeleton when I did this. I would say that there are four common points that underlie all Christianity. And the first is impermanence. Jesus was the Word become flesh. So in order to become flesh, the Word had to change forms. He lived, died, descended into hell, rose, and ascended. So there's all sorts of changing of forms in which the challenge is to continue to recognize that the word that was in the beginning is here, and we're invited into the way that impermanence flexes our inner muscles of recognizing what we knew to be true in a different form, right? So impermanence seems to me to be built into the way that Christ became flesh, lived, died, descended, ascended, all of that. I do think non-self is more of a Christian teaching than we are accustomed to acknowledging. Self was that first garment of leaves that Adam and Eve made themselves in the garden. But understand that that is Adam and Eve making an identity for themselves. They were made people with bodies. The bodies were given to them as they exited Eden. But to be a self, that was their doing, right? And I think part of the message of Jesus, part of the message, particularly of the crucifixion, is you don't need to be a self in order to get the job of being an incarnate person done. There was when Jesus said, "Into your hands I commend my spirit," I think within the limits of, not having quite the same language as I'm using at his fingertips, Jesus was giving his self into the hands of the Father. He was ceasing to sort of push and pull his own journey and letting the Father do the whole thing in him. So I do believe non-self to be a Christian teaching taught by, if nothing else, the form of Jesus's life. I do think acceptance is something that all Christian teaching has in common. Jesus said, "I am present in the poor, I'm present in the homeless, I'm present in the imprisoned, I'm present in the hungry, I'm present in the naked," all of that, and then some. And then he also said, "You're gonna, I'm the gate for the sheep, I am the bread of life." And he said these things to a bread-eating audience of shepherds, right? So he's teaching them to, when they interact with the stuff of their daily lives, to actually see him, all right? And then when you take that and you go further into Christian history, you've got people like, I believe it was Teresa of Avila, who said the priest is another Christ. That got expanded to the Christian is another Christ. And then we look back at St. Paul saying, "My true self is hidden with Christ in God." So we're going closer and closer to saying, you know what? Our true self is Christ, And what's Christ going to do? He's going to give all things over to the Father. What does that mean? That's like saying, improve yourself and then give it up. Improve yourself and then give it up. So non-self is the end stage teaching toward which Christ was going when he said, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." And acceptance was the end stage of his self-emptying. He did also talk, Christ did, about interbeing. Not only did he do the things like blur the lines between the stuff that his bread-eating audience of shepherds was seeing around them, he did say, "I am the bread of life, I am the gate for the sheep." He also said, "I am in the Father and the Father is in me," and we are in the Christian community. He was blurring the lines, blurring the sort of borders that we would identify as otherness, and I think he was doing it on purpose. So I do think that interbeing, while that may have been a term created by Buddhists, it's very much functionally something that Jesus was trying to teach. Even his rising as a stranger, he was trying to sort of teach that even though it's disorienting that this person looks different than you remember Jesus to have looked, there's a reason for, if you want, if there's a, I'm using that disorientation so that you can identify Christ not as what you remember him to be, but you can identify with Christ whatever is right in front of you. So again, to sum up, to think about Tantra, it is a mystical path, a wisdom path, whose common denominators are impermanence, non-self, acceptance, and interbeing. And as those four, I'm going to use a silly term that will tip my hat to my admiration of Buddhists, but they are the four gospel seals: impermanence, non-self, acceptance, and interbeing. As we accept those, we are brought more and more into an embodied living imitation of Christ, who, because of those things, was able to do all this sort of changing of forms and this recapitulating of all creation. And ultimately, that's what students have to do. My mind is malleable because I can accept that, like Jesus, I have to change forms too. My ego is malleable because, like Jesus, I have to improve what's going on in me. In fact, divinize what's going on in me until I hand it over to the Father. Acceptance is something that I have to do as a practitioner, because not only am I grieving a teacher who died violently, but I am also going to die in the end. And interbeing is important because why would concepts without elasticity do anything other than cause suffering? So by putting a little bit of stock in interbeing, my concepts gain the kind of elasticity that allows me to accept everything life's going to throw at me. It's worth thinking about. Yeah, that's all. Thanks for listening. Have a good day.